She was a homeless pregnant wife sleeping under bridges and eating from garbage cans, but the diamond ring hidden in her coat pocket was worth more than the entire block she slept on. A poor beggar found her on the coldest night of winter and brought food to her every single day after that. But he had no idea he was feeding someone who could buy his entire neighborhood with a single signature. Her husband's mother had called her worthless. Her husband's mistress had called her a charity case. Together they threw her out of her own home while her billionaire husband watched and said nothing. But none of them, not the mother, not the mistress, not even the billionaire himself, knew about the $1 trillion inheritance she had been hiding since before she ever said, "I do." But she let them believe she was broken. But she let them think they had won. But she waited in silence, feeding pigeons and accepting bread from a poor beggar, until the day her billionaire husband arrived at her door, laughing at her misery. But that laugh was the most expensive mistake of his life. But what she did next didn't just leave him bankrupt. It left him on his knees, begging for mercy from a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. But the story doesn't end with revenge. It ends with love, because the poor beggar who fed her when she had nothing became the man she married when she had everything. But who was this poor beggar whose kindness captured a trillionaire's heart? But what drove a mother and mistress to unite against a pregnant woman? But why would someone worth trillions choose to be homeless? But what weapon did she use that destroyed a billionaire in less than 48 hours? But how did a simple act of bringing food turn into a love story that shocked the entire nation? The rain fell like needles against the windows of the Harrison mansion. But inside, the coldest thing in that house was not the weather. It was the eyes of Margaret Harrison as she stared at her daughter-in-law with a hatred that had been building for 3 long years. "You were never good enough for my son," Margaret hissed through teeth clenched tight enough to crack diamonds. But her words were not the worst part. The worst part was the woman standing beside her, Vanessa Cole, with her perfectly manicured nails wrapped around a glass of champagne that belonged to the wife she was replacing. Caroline Harrison stood in the center of the living room, her hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant, 7 months of carrying the heir to the Harrison fortune. But none of that mattered to the 2 women who had already decided her fate. "Bradley doesn't love you anymore," Vanessa said, with a smile that dripped poison. But she wasn't just the mistress. She was Margaret's hand-picked replacement, a woman with no morals but plenty of ambition, chosen specifically to destroy the marriage that Margaret had never approved of. But where was Bradley Harrison? Where was the billionaire husband who had promised to love and protect Caroline until death? He was standing in the doorway of his own home, watching his pregnant wife being humiliated. But he said nothing. His silence was louder than any words. His silence was the knife that cut deepest. "Bradley, please," Caroline whispered, her voice breaking like glass against stone. But her husband looked away. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of devotion, 3 years of building a life together. But none of it mattered when his mother demanded loyalty. But what Margaret Harrison didn't know, what Vanessa Cole couldn't have imagined, what even Bradley himself had never discovered, was that the woman they were throwing out into the rain was not the helpless orphan they believed her to be. Caroline Mitchell Harrison had a secret. Before she became Mrs. Harrison, before she fell in love with a man who would betray her, before she ever stepped foot in this mansion that now rejected her, Caroline had inherited something that made the Harrison billions look like spare change. Her grandmother, Elizabeth Mitchell, had been the silent founder of Mitchell Global Industries, a conglomerate so vast, so powerful, that its true worth had never been publicly disclosed. But Caroline knew the number. She had seen the documents on her 18th birthday. $1.7 trillion, all of it waiting in trust until she chose to claim it. But she never claimed it, but she never told anyone. But she married Bradley Harrison believing that love mattered more than money, believing that a simple life built on genuine connection was worth more than all the gold in the world. But she was wrong. "Get out," Margaret commanded, pointing toward the door, with a finger that had signed away the futures of many enemies. But Caroline was about to become her greatest enemy. She just didn't know it yet. "Take nothing. You came into this family with nothing, and you will leave with nothing." But that was the lie that would destroy them all. Because Caroline didn't come with nothing. She came with everything. But she had hidden it behind a smile and a gentle heart that they had all mistaken for weakness. The rain soaked through her thin dress the moment she stepped outside. No shoes, no coat, no phone, no money. But she had something far more valuable. She had patience, and she had a plan that would take everything from the people who had taken everything from her. But that first night on the streets nearly broke her. Caroline walked for hours through neighborhoods that grew darker and more dangerous with every block. Her feet bled against the concrete, her pregnant belly ached with every step. But she refused to claim her inheritance. Not yet, not until she had proven to herself what people were truly made of when they didn't know who she really was. But then she found the warehouse. It was abandoned, covered in graffiti, surrounded by broken bottles and forgotten dreams. But it had a small overhang that blocked the rain, and that night it became her home. But she wasn't alone for long. The next morning, just as the sun crept over the broken skyline, a shadow fell across her face. Caroline opened her eyes, ready to run, ready to fight, but what she saw made her freeze. It was a man. His clothes were torn, his shoes had holes, his face was weathered by years of hardship, but his eyes were the kindest she had ever seen. He held out a piece of bread wrapped in newspaper. "You look like you need this more than me," said the poor beggar named Daniel Wright. But who was this man who had nothing yet gave everything? But why did his kindness feel more valuable than all the billions she had left behind? But what would happen when the billionaire who threw her out came looking for her? Daniel Wright had not always been a poor beggar, but life has a way of breaking even the strongest men. And Daniel had been broken more times than he could count. 10 years ago, he had been a promising architect with a small firm, a loving fiancé, and a future bright enough to blind anyone who looked directly at it. But then his business partner embezzled every dollar from their company. But then his fiancé left him for a wealthier man. But then his mother fell ill with cancer, and every penny he had went toward hospital bills that insurance refused to cover. But when she died in his arms, Daniel had nothing left. No money, no home, no reason to keep fighting. But he kept fighting anyway. The streets had taught him lessons that no university ever could. They taught him that kindness was the only currency that never lost its value. They taught him that a warm meal shared was worth more than a cold mansion owned alone. But most importantly, they taught him to recognize pain in others, because he had lived with pain every single day for a decade. But the moment he saw Caroline huddled beneath that warehouse overhang, something shifted inside his chest. She was different from the other homeless people he had encountered. Her hands were too soft, her posture was too refined, her eyes carried a sadness that spoke of fresh wounds rather than old scars. But it was her belly, round and heavy with new life, that made Daniel's heart crack wide open. "You look like you need this more than me," he had said, offering the bread he had planned to eat for his only meal that day. But Caroline had looked at him with suspicion first. The streets had already begun teaching her their harsh lessons. But when she saw the genuine warmth in his eyes, warmth that asked for nothing in return, she accepted the bread with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, but those two words carried more weight than she knew. They were the first kind words she had spoken since being thrown out of her own home. They were the first acknowledgement that humanity still existed in a world that had shown her only cruelty. But Daniel didn't stop there. Every single morning after that first meeting, he walked 3 miles across the city to bring her food. Some days it was bread he had collected from a bakery that threw out day-old loaves. Some days it was fruit from a vendor who took pity on him. But some days, the days when Daniel had found nothing, he gave her his own portion and told her he had already eaten. But he hadn't. But Caroline began to notice. She noticed how his hands trembled from hunger some mornings. She noticed how his cheekbones grew sharper as the weeks passed. But she also noticed something else, something that made her see him differently than any man she had ever known. He never asked for anything in return. Not once did Daniel ask who she was. Not once did he ask why a pregnant woman was living on the streets. Not once did he ask for money, for favors, for anything that would benefit himself. But every morning, without fail, he appeared with whatever small offering he could find. And every morning he smiled at her like she was the most important person in the world. But Caroline's mind often wandered back to the man who should have protected her, the man who had vowed to love her in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer. Bradley Harrison had been charming when they first met, but that charm was a mask. Behind closed doors he was weak, controlled entirely by his mother's iron will, and manipulated easily by any woman who knew how to stroke his ego. But Caroline had been too in love to see the truth. She had ignored the warning signs. She had dismissed the way Margaret looked at her with barely concealed contempt. She had pretended not to notice when Bradley began coming home late, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. But the night Vanessa Cole walked into her home and announced that she was pregnant with Bradley's child, that was the night Caroline's world shattered completely. But here was the twist that would haunt Bradley Harrison forever. Vanessa wasn't actually pregnant, but she had lied to secure her position. But Margaret had helped her create fake medical documents. But together they had orchestrated the perfect scheme to remove Caroline from the family before she gave birth to the true Harrison heir. But Caroline didn't know about this deception yet, but she would discover it soon. But when she did, it would become the weapon that destroyed them all. Meanwhile, as the weeks passed beneath that warehouse overhang, something unexpected began to grow between Caroline and Daniel. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was something deeper. It was trust. It was friendship. It was two broken souls recognizing each other in the darkness and choosing to share what little light they had. "Why do you help me?" Caroline asked one morning as Daniel handed her a small container of soup he had somehow acquired. But Daniel's answer was simple. "Because someone helped me once when I had nothing, but they died before I could repay them. But I made a promise to myself that I would pass that kindness forward whenever I could." But Caroline felt tears burning behind her eyes. This poor beggar, this man with holes in his shoes and patches on his coat, had more integrity than her billionaire husband had ever possessed. But she couldn't tell him the truth about who she was. Not yet. But she made a silent promise to herself in that moment. When she finally claimed her $1 trillion inheritance, Daniel Wright would never struggle again. But fate had other plans first. Because exactly 6 weeks after Caroline was thrown onto the streets, a black limousine pulled up to the warehouse district. But the man who stepped out wasn't there to help. Bradley Harrison had found her, but he hadn't come with apologies, but he hadn't come with regret. He had come to laugh. But what Bradley didn't know was that his laughter would cost him everything he had ever owned. But what he didn't know was that the homeless woman before him held documents that could destroy his empire with a single signature. But what he didn't know was that his cruelty in this moment would be the final nail in his own coffin. But how would Caroline execute her revenge? But what role would Daniel play in the destruction of the Harrison empire? But would the truth about Vanessa's fake pregnancy finally be exposed? Bradley Harrison stepped out of his black limousine with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the cracked pavement of the warehouse district, but he didn't care about the dirt. He had come to witness the destruction of the woman he had once promised to cherish forever. but forever meant nothing to a man like Bradley. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery as he approached the overhang where Caroline sat on flattened cardboard. "Look how far the mighty have fallen." But Caroline didn't flinch, but she didn't cry, but she didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she looked up at her husband with eyes that had grown colder than the winter wind, eyes that held secrets he couldn't begin to imagine. "Did you come here to gloat, Bradley?" she asked, her voice steady as steel. "Or did your mother send you to make sure I was suffering enough?" But Bradley laughed. It was a cruel sound, sharp and hollow, echoing off the warehouse walls like a curse. "My mother was right about you all along. You were never anything but a gold digger pretending to be a good wife. But look at you now. Homeless, pregnant, eating scraps like a stray dog." But what Bradley didn't notice was the figure standing in the shadows 20 feet away. Daniel Wright had arrived with his morning offering of food, but the moment he saw the limousine, he had hidden himself behind a concrete pillar. But he heard every word, but his fists clenched tight enough to draw blood from his own palms. But Caroline remained calm. "Is Vanessa enjoying my jewelry?" Caroline asked with a smile that confused Bradley completely. "Is she sleeping well in my bed? Is your mother proud of the family she destroyed?" But Bradley's laughter grew louder. "Vanessa is everything you never were. She's carrying my child, my real heir, not whatever that thing in your belly is." But those words were the mistake that sealed his fate, because Caroline had spent 6 weeks on the streets, but she hadn't spent them doing nothing. She had used a library computer to access her grandmother's legal team. She had made phone calls from a burner phone Daniel had found discarded in an alley. But most importantly, she had gathered evidence of the conspiracy that had thrown her onto the streets. "Vanessa isn't pregnant, Bradley," Caroline said, her voice cutting through his laughter like a blade through silk. "She never was." But Bradley's laughter stopped, but his smile faltered. But for the first time since he had arrived, uncertainty flickered across his arrogant face. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, but his voice cracked on the last word, a crack that would soon become a complete collapse. "I have the medical records," Caroline continued, rising slowly to her feet despite her heavy belly. "The real ones, not the forgeries your mother paid Dr. Henderson to create. But I also have the wire transfers proving your mother bribed him. But I also have emails between Margaret and Vanessa planning this entire scheme. But most importantly, Bradley, I have something you never knew about." But Caroline reached into the pocket of her tattered coat, the same coat she had worn for 6 weeks straight. But what she pulled out made Bradley, Harrison's blood turn to ice. It was a single document, weathered and worn but bearing a seal that Bradley recognized immediately. It was the seal of Mitchell Global Industries, the most powerful conglomerate in the Western Hemisphere. "My grandmother was Elizabeth Mitchell," Carolyn said, watching the color drain from her husband's face. "But I never told you because I wanted to know if you loved me for who I was, not for what I was worth. But now I have my answer." But Bradley's legs began to tremble. "That's impossible. Elizabeth Mitchell died without any heirs. The fortune went into a trust controlled by me," Caroline finished. $1.7 trillion, Bradley. But you threw me out for a woman who lied about being pregnant. But your mother called me worthless while I held documents that could buy her entire bloodline 1,000 times over. But you stood there and watched while I was humiliated. And now you will watch while everything you love is taken from you." But Bradley fell to his knees, but the Italian leather of his expensive shoes pressed into the dirty pavement. But the man who had arrived laughing was now shaking with terror. "Caroline, please," he begged, reaching for her hand. But she stepped back, away from his touch, away from his lies, away from the life she had wasted on a man who deserved nothing. "I didn't know. I was manipulated. My mother—" "Your mother will lose everything too," Caroline said coldly. But so will Vanessa. But so will every person who helped orchestrate my humiliation. I've already contacted my legal team, but by tomorrow morning, Harrison Industries will face the largest hostile takeover in American history. But every asset your family owns will be frozen. But every board member who supported your mother will be removed. But you, Bradley Harrison, will be left with nothing. But Bradley began to sob. But the billionaire who had mocked his homeless pregnant wife was now a broken man groveling in the dirt. "Please," he whimpered, "please have mercy. I'll do anything. I'll divorce Vanessa. I'll remove my mother from the company. I'll give you everything." "You have nothing to give me," Caroline interrupted. "But I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this because people like you need to learn that kindness matters more than wealth. But you never learned that lesson. But now you will." But as Bradley collapsed completely onto the ground, begging and crying for mercy that would never come, Daniel Wright emerged from the shadows. But he didn't look at the broken billionaire. But he only had eyes for the remarkable woman who had endured so much, yet stood stronger than anyone he had ever known. But their eyes met across the dirty pavement. But in that moment something shifted between them, something that had been building for 6 weeks, of shared bread and quiet conversations. But the revenge wasn't complete yet. But Margaret and Vanessa still needed to face justice. But the world needed to know the truth about the homeless pregnant wife who was secretly worth more than them all. But what would happen when Margaret Harrison discovered her empire was crumbling? But how would Vanessa react when her lies were exposed to the world? But would Caroline's revenge bring her peace? Or would she need something more to heal her broken heart? The news spread across every television screen in America, like wildfire consuming dry forest. But this wasn't ordinary news. This was the kind of scandal that destroyed dynasties and rewrote history books. "Breaking news tonight," the anchor announced with barely concealed excitement. Harrison Industries, once valued at $12 billion, has been completely acquired in what experts are calling the most devastating hostile takeover in corporate history. But the shocking twist, the woman behind this financial earthquake, is none other than Caroline Mitchell Harrison, the reportedly homeless wife who was thrown out of the Harrison mansion just 2 months ago. But Margaret Harrison was watching this broadcast from her living room when federal agents knocked on her door. But she didn't answer. She couldn't answer, because her legs had stopped working the moment she saw Caroline's face on that screen. But the agents didn't wait for permission, but they entered, with a warrant for her arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of medical documents. "You can't do this to me," Margaret screamed as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "Do you know who I am? I am Margaret Harrison." But the lead agent looked at her with cold indifference. "You're nobody now, ma'am, but your daughter-in-law made sure of that." But 3 miles across the city, Vanessa Cole was facing her own destruction. But hers came not from federal agents, but from the internet itself. Caroline's legal team had released every piece of evidence to the media: the fake pregnancy tests, the forged medical documents, the emails proving Vanessa had never carried Bradley's child. But within hours, Vanessa's face was trending on every social media platform with hashtags that would follow her forever. But Vanessa tried to run. But she packed her designer bags with jewelry that didn't belong to her. But she called every wealthy man in her contact list, begging for help. But nobody answered. But nobody wanted to be associated with the most hated woman in America. But when Vanessa finally opened her apartment door to flee, she found reporters waiting, dozens of them, with cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward her face. "Ms. Cole, is it true you faked a pregnancy to steal another woman's husband?" "Ms. Cole, do you have any comment on the federal charges being filed against you?" "Ms. Cole, how does it feel to be exposed as a fraud?" But Vanessa collapsed onto her doorstep and wept. But her tears earned no sympathy. But the woman who had smiled while throwing a pregnant wife onto the streets, was now drowning in the consequences of her own cruelty. But the most satisfying destruction was reserved for Bradley Harrison himself. Caroline had been precise in her revenge. She didn't just take his company, she took everything. His bank accounts were frozen, his properties were seized, his cars were repossessed. But the final blow came when his own board of directors released a public statement denouncing him and pledging their full cooperation with Caroline's new leadership. But Bradley Harrison, once worth $3 billion, was now worth nothing. But the man who had laughed at his homeless pregnant wife was now homeless himself, evicted from the mansion that had been in his family for 4 generations. But Caroline felt no joy in his suffering. But she felt something else instead, something that surprised her. She felt free, but freedom meant nothing without someone to share it with.